"Get down. He's hit," someone shouted as another invisible round cracked over the rocks, and the SEALs who had been warned about hidden snipers finally realized the warning was real while the one woman crouched beside them with a tablet was told to shut up and stay off the gun because she was just a civilian. The wounded operator was bleeding into the dust because the leader had chosen this narrow valley after command called her sniper intel low probability. And now every second they spent pinned here meant the convoy behind them rolled closer into the same kill zone. She flattened herself against the stone because the last shot had come in low, so close she had felt it tug the sleeve of her borrowed combat shirt, and she kept whisper counting the delay between the cracks and the thuds because the timing told her where the shooters were. But the platoon leader hissed at her to quit talking on net and stop backseat shooting in front of everyone, which meant her only weapon for the moment was a screen full of ignored numbers. The men were doing what they had been trained to do, scanning ridgelines with optics and scopes, but because the valley walls were broken into dozens of fake angles and shadows, every rock looked like it could hide a barrel, so nobody dared break cover to flank. Another round hit so close to the first casualty that gravel showered his chest plate, and because the medic needed seconds he didn't have, he yelled for more smoke, which meant they burned another precious resource just to keep the snipers blind for a heartbeat while they tightened tourniquets and shoved gauze into the wound. She felt the pressure of the clock like a hand on her back because the convoy behind them had checked in on schedule just minutes ago, engines headed toward this same corridor. And she knew that if those drivers rolled into this funnel while the snipers still owned the high ground, the number of bleeding men in the date would multiply fast. She tried again, keeping her voice level even though her pulse hammered, reminding the leader that her pre-mission models had flagged this valley as catastrophic if compromised, because the overlapping arcs on her tablet were not theory now but reality plotted in blood. Yet his jaw clenched as he barked that intel had already been assessed and command had said to move, so second-guessing decisions under fire would get more people killed. Because his helmet cam and hers were streaming back to the Tactical Operations Center, someone in the rear asked sharply why the civilian was even forward at the point of contact, which only made the leader more determined to show he had her under control, so he ordered her behind a low beam away from the rifles on the comm panel. She did what the contract said and slid back behind the BAM because she was still technically observe and report only, but because that BAM stole her direct line of sight to the upper ridges, she had to rely on echoes and physics instead of clean visuals, which meant her models grew fuzzier just as the shots grew more precise. The next volley came in with terrifying confidence, rounds walking closer along the rock lip of their cover, and one round punched a fist-sized crater inches from another SEAL's helmet, so he cursed and pressed himself flatter, muttering that whoever was out there knew exactly where they were breathing. Because the shooters remained unseen, the medevac bird that had lifted off when the first man went down was told to abort its approach and hold beyond the ridge, and that meant their bleeding clock stretched into a dangerous gray zone where every minute of delay translated into lost blood and colder skin. The woman watched the wounded operator's chest rise and fall in ragged jerks and knew that if this continued much longer, they would not just be talking about a leg lost to shrapnel, but a heart that stopped before any rotor wash touched this valley. She checked her tablet again, fingers moving automatically, because she had spent months feeding real-range footage into models that predicted exactly this kind of overlapping sniper trap, and each new impact gave her more data to triangulate. Yet because she was not on the roster as a shooter, her numbers were treated as after-action curiosities, not instructions. She saw it clearly now. The warning she had pushed before they stepped off, the red overlay painted across this valley on her screen, had been downgraded to a footnote by someone behind a desk who never planned to crawl through this dust, and because that decision had seemed reasonable in a briefing room, 12 men and one non-combatant were now lying under stone and smoke while invisible barrels hunted for skin. The younger SEAL closest to her glanced back because he had noticed her hands were steady while everyone else shook, and he asked under his breath if she had ever actually fired anything past a flat range. But before she could answer, another operator laughed bitterly and said she was there to test algorithms, not to save them, which meant the only potential ally she had inside the team was socially silenced in a sentence. A compact suppressed rifle with a strange prototype optic leaned unused against a rock near their wounded sniper, and because of the institutional rule that civilians did not touch weapons, nobody picked it up even though the one man trained to use it could not lift his own head from the date. She listened to the leader relay the tactical operations center's questions about their status. And because the staff back in air conditioning needed to understand why a team of SEALs could be pinned by unseen shooters, they asked pointedly whether the route choice had been followed or whether anyone had freelanced. The leader's voice tightened as he admitted they were in the planned corridor, which meant the institutional blame now needed someplace else to land. And the obvious target was the one with no rank on her chest and no voice in the chain of command. She knew exactly how she looked to them, because she had seen it often in training environments. The nerd with the tablet, the contractor brought forward as a test, tolerated until the first shot, then pushed aside so the real work could begin. That history was not abstract. It was the reason she had fought just to be allowed to embed with this team. And because the contract they had written to protect themselves also wrapped around her, the same lines that got her here now threatened to make her useless exactly when her skills mattered. Smoke thinned, and because the wind shifted again in the worst way, it pulled their screen apart and exposed new slivers of bodies and rifles to the hidden glass on the ridges, so the next crack-womp echoed with smug precision, shattering a rock just behind the medic's shoulder. The medic hunched down, swearing that they could not keep doing this, and because the wounded man's blood was already soaking through bandages that had been meant for minor shrapnel, he shouted that if they didn't move soon, it wouldn't matter how perfect the evacuation plan looked on a briefing slide. In the Tactical Operations Center, someone made the predictable choice, because they could not see the shooters from the drone feed either, and because they had to be seen managing risk, they suggested a controlled withdrawal from the valley while accepting that the wounded man might have to be left behind until later. That was the moment she felt a different kind of cold move through her, because the math on her tablet said that any withdrawal along the current route would take the team through exactly the overlapping arc she had plotted in red, which meant the controlled withdrawal would walk men into fire with their backs turned. She pushed another package of data up the chain, tagging it as urgent threat to the convoy and to any withdrawal path, because she still believed that proof might matter if it was clear enough, but the response came back fast. Her model was non-verified civilian analysis and could not be used to override on-the-ground judgment or pre-approved routes. The words were polite, but the meaning was simple. In the eyes of the system, her math did not beat their doctrine, even when both were describing the same valley under the same sky. The convoy called in again, rolling toward the mouth of the corridor because that had been the plan, and because nobody in the air-conditioned room had the authority or courage to halt them based purely on a contractor's numbers. The trucks kept moving, engines echoing faintly through the rocks. She watched the icon on her tablet inch closer, a small digital symbol that represented dozens of hearts and lungs and pairs of eyes that did not know this valley had just turned into a shooting gallery. And because their steps were tied to those icons, the men beside her felt the same weight pressing on their shoulders. The leader, squeezed between institutional discipline and the worsening field reality, chose something that looked like action. He ordered more smoke and a rushed drag of the wounded man deeper behind an outcropping, hoping that motion under concealment would buy them enough breathing room to think. Because smoke did not stop bullets, only eyes. The hidden snipers used the new plumes as reference points, firing into the edges where they knew men would move, and one more SEAL cried out as a round ripped into his arm, splitting their already thin medical supplies between two bleeding bodies. Every decision they had made within the rules had narrowed their options further, and because she had obeyed each limitation put on her, she had helped keep the trigger unmanned and the experimental rifle idle. She recognized the shape of the trap now not just in the geometry of the ridges but in the geometry of the institution itself, because every safeguard meant to prevent a civilian from causing harm was now preventing the only person with the right model in her head from stopping it. The minefield and unexploded ordnance in the side gullies, which had been just another line on the mission brief, now sat in her mind like steel doors. They could not move to the flanks without risking a chain of blasts, so the team and the convoy and the wounded belonged to the angles on her screen. That was the hard edge that turned restraint into danger, and because she understood it, she knew that if she did nothing, the next phase of this story would be written in body counts. She leaned forward from behind the berm, voice low so the microphones would not catch everything, and told the leader that the pattern in her logs confirmed at least 3 separate firing positions, each using the others to mask their sound, which meant the longer they waited, the smarter those shooters would become about their breathing and timing. He stared at her with fury already built by pressure from above, and because he knew that the Tactical Operations Center was listening and ready to judge him for letting a contractor influence his men, he threatened her with immediate extraction and blacklisting if she so much as touched a weapon. She pulled back and let the next volley come, still clinging to the thin hope that her last data push would finally make someone at a console slam a fist on the table and order the convoy to stop. But the movement on her tablet told a different story as the convoy icon slid inexorably closer. When the shots landed this time, the dust spouts and impacts marched almost playfully along the trail that convoy ties would soon follow, and that visual confirmed what she had already suspected. The snipers could not see the trucks yet, but they were adjusting their arcs for when the engines got loud. Because the Tactical Operations Center finally admitted that the convoy was in danger yet still refused to reroute it on her math alone, they doubled down on the withdrawal order for the patrol, telling the leader to pull his team back toward a shallow saddle that the models on her tablet painted crimson. The patrol tried to obey, moving in bursts under what was left of the smoke, and because the snipers were not machines but people who had been watching their rhythms, they shifted to an angle none of the SEALs had anticipated, sending rounds slicing across their path from the side. An enfilade line of dust and rock burst across their movement, and two of the men were nearly caught out of cover entirely, which ripped away the last illusion that they were dealing with a single shooter on a single ridge. She heard the word multiple hiss through clenched teeth as realization spread, and because that realization came too late to be used inside the rules they had already followed, the situation upgraded in the space of heartbeats from tough contact to the verge of slaughter. All the conventional levers had been pulled, smoke, withdrawal, waiting for aerial eyes, and each had only tightened the trap because the rules they lived by did not account for someone like her using math as a weapon. She felt the fee swirl with anger in her chest, not just at the shooters but at the system that had kept her hands empty, because now the trap shape was simple. If she continued to honor her non-combatant label, men would die in a pattern she had already predicted. The choice in front of her was not abstract. It was written in the grainy feed of the convoy icon, in the slowing chest rise of the wounded operator, in the tremor in the leader's voice as he tried to sound in control for the Tactical Operations Center. Because every path that stayed inside the lines led to the same red endpoint. She understood she had reached the last junction where her refusal to act could plausibly be called obedience rather than complicity. When the next crack split the air, closer and meaner, she did not wait for permission. She lunged out from behind the berm toward the unused experimental rifle, fingers closing on the stock before the leader could grab her arm. Because incoming rounds pinned him prone for a precious heartbeat, his hand slapped stone instead of her wrist, and she rolled against the rock, jamming the rifle into her shoulder while her other hand flicked her tablet awake. The angles she had charted were already there, a lattice of probable hides etched over the terrain, and because she had been listening to the echoes and counting the delays even while silenced, she knew which slice of rock had spoken last. She breathed once to steady her heart, not because she had been trained as they had, but because old range hours and simulator nights had taught her that panic widened groups more reliably than wind. The crosshairs landed not on a head or barrel, nothing so clean, but on a patch of stone that sat exactly where her calculation said a prone shooter's chest would be, sheltered by a lip and masked by an echo. Because she trusted the math more than her fear of the contract clause she was about to break, she squeezed the trigger, and the suppressed crack of the rifle answered the distant report with a quieter, focused violence. On a helmet feed and a drone camera miles away, a barely visible figure jerked and slumped behind that rock as a faint puff of dust and fabric marked the impact. And because those feeds were being watched by people who knew what impossible shots looked like, a new kind of silence fell in the Tactical Operations Center. The leader shouted her name as a curse because a civilian had just fired a lethal round under his command, but the men pressed into the data around her felt something else. The first seconds and too long when fire from above did not immediately answer their movement. The hidden snipers reacted like any hunters whose blind had just taken a hit. They shifted positions and fired fast at the spot where her muzzle flash had been, and because hurried shots were less disciplined, their rounds gave off glints of glass and small dust trails that betrayed new perches. She saw those faint giveaways through the prototype optics wider, cleaner glass, and used them not as perfect tells but as corrections to her models, walking her next shots along an invisible corridor of probabilities. She did not fire like a conventional sniper with a spotter calling wind. She fired like a mathematician with a gun, chaining corrections from one impact to the next because the terrain model in her head had been trained on hundreds of hours of similar valleys. Because every successful hit stripped one overlapping arc from the enemy's control, the kill box that had held the patrol began to fracture, and each fractured arc gave the medic another second to stabilize a wound or drag a body a meter farther into cover. Down in the valley, the men started to move with more purpose, not because the danger was gone, but because the pattern of incoming fire had shifted from confident to frantic, and in that change they recognized that the unseen enemy was now reacting instead of dictating. The leader still yelled for someone to get the rifle out of her hands, because the contract language about civilians and lethal force was carved into his sense of responsibility, yet nobody reached her in time before the next round of shots left another enemy silent on the ridge. In the Tactical Operations Center, the staff saw the same feeds and knew two truths at once. A non-cleared shooter was engaging, and those engagements were the only reason the convoy had been able to halt safely outside the valley mouth when the updated danger call finally reached them. Because engines could be ordered to stop, but bullets could not be ordered to vanish. The only variable that had actually changed the physics of the trap was the woman with the tablet and the rifle, and that fact lodged like grit in the gears of doctrine. When the last crack from the ridges faded without a follow-up, the patrol did not cheer. They held their breath and waited to see if anyone would be foolish enough to test the silence with a careless movement. She kept the rifle tight for another long count, scanning every suspicious shadow her models had highlighted, and because no more dust puffs or glints answered, she finally let herself exhale and lower the weapon. The leader crawled over and ripped the rifle from her hands, fury and relief fighting in his eyes because she had saved his men by doing the one thing he had told her not to do. And because his helmet camera recorded that moment, it captured the exact second when survival and discipline tore at the same chain. He ordered her separated from the team and placed under watch, even as he yelled for the medic to prep the wounded for the medevac bird that was finally cleared to approach, which meant that in the same breath he acknowledged her effectiveness and invoked the machinery that would try to punish it. The convoy remained outside the valley, engines idling safe beneath the same sun that had lit the trap, and because those drivers never saw the bodies cooling on the ridges, they would only hear later that something had gone wrong up ahead and been handled. The Tactical Operations Center began drafting incident reports and evidence chains even before the rotors drowned out the sounds of the valley, because the system's reflex was to process violations as much as victories. She rode out of the kill zone not in triumph but in a seat designated for detainees, hands-free but watched, because a civilian had just taken lethal action under fire, and the institution could not let that pass without paperwork sharp enough to cut. The tablet that had saved them was bagged as evidence alongside the rifle, and because every log and timestamp on it matched the sequence of the firefight, those numbers would now speak louder than anything she might try to explain with her voice. In the days that followed, when the dust and blood were washed from gear and the patrol scattered back to their routines, she sat in an interview room under fluorescent light while investigators replayed the same minutes from multiple angles, stopping each time her voice suggested a risk or her shots landed. Because the initial drafts of the story emphasized her breach of contract and rules of engagement, the questions she faced were not how did you save them, but why did you think you had the right to act? And each answer she gave was measured against paragraphs of legal text written long before any of them had seen this valley. A review board convened with a stack of reports that painted her as the problem in a mission that had gone sideways, and because investigators and legal officers were trained to protect the structure before the individual, the default instinct was to classify, contain, and reprimand. The recommendation forming on paper was simple: termination of her contract, possible charges, and an internal memo reminding commands not to let civilians near the point of contact, as if distance from danger would erase the blind spot that had nearly killed them all. Before that recommendation could be stamped, a senior Special Operations commander who had not been in the valley requested to see the raw helmet footage and drone feeds for himself, because years of experience had taught him that compressed summaries often hid the real story. The board paused its rush toward punishment and watched with him as the valley unfolded again in grainy, shaking images. The ignored warnings, the tightening fire, the failed smoke and withdrawal, the convoy drawing near, and then the impossible sequence when a contractor picked up a rifle and turned math into survival. The commander stopped the playback repeatedly, rewinding to the moments when her calm voice called out angles that matched the later discovered hides, and because he understood the odds of those calls landing that cleanly by accident, he asked why someone with that level of field-ready skill was classified on paper only as a simulation analyst. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by legal language about liability and risk, which did nothing to answer the real question of why their system had needed to be dragged toward reality by a woman it had tried to keep behind a barrier. He pointed out the minefield and unexploded ordnance zones on the drone map, highlighting how they had pinned the patrol into that valley and made any flanking maneuver suicidal. And because those constraints were not theoretical but visible scars on the earth, they made it obvious that precision sniper fire from the inside was the only physics-compliant solution. The words "unauthorized use of force" on the draft findings sat beside images of convoy trucks halted just short of the kill zone, and the collision between those two narratives fractured the confidence in the room. When the board watched the sequence where the leader shouted at her to stay off the gun, then later moved to rip the rifle away after her shots broke the trap, several SEALs who had been in the valley shifted in their chairs because the footage reflected back their own misjudgment. At the commander's request, those men spoke not as witnesses against her, but as survivors, explaining that every time they tried a doctrinal move and failed, her voice and her math had been the only things that pointed toward a path that did not end with letters home. Because those testimonies aligned perfectly with the timestamps on her tablet logs and the shape of the firefight, the idea that she had been reckless or lucky strained past breaking. The board members, who had entered the room ready to rubber stamp a reprimand and move on, now faced a different pressure. If they buried this story under civilian misconduct, they would be telling their own operators that the system preferred clean paperwork to honest cause and effect. The commander leaned on that pressure with quiet precision, framing her choices not as a rebellion against rules but as the inevitable outcome of a situation where the institution had used every channel to ignore its own numbers. He read aloud the observe and report only clause from her contract, then placed beside it the record of attempt she had made to warn the Tactical Operations Center and the leader before ever touching the rifle. And because the trail of ignored messages was longer than the interval in which she had fired, the breach looked less like arrogance and more like overdue reality. By the time the screens went dark, the option to treat her as a simple scapegoat had dissolved, replaced by a narrower path that acknowledged both her violation and the failures that had forced it. The board could either publicly recognize a civilian who had saved a convoy and a patrol by breaking a rule, or they could quietly adjust doctrine while pretending on paper that she was only a problem to be disciplined, and both choices came with costs that would echo through the ranks. The commander proposed a compromise framed as operational security rather than sentiment, classify the mission details and her role at a level that kept them out of headlines, issue her a formal written reprimand to protect the principle of civilian non-combatant status, and simultaneously offer her a place in a compartmentalized program where her skills could be used legally under tighter control. Because the board feared the chaos that might come from making her a public symbol, they accepted that path, choosing secrecy and internal evolution over open celebration. She learned the outcome in a room much smaller than the one where her fate had been discussed, sitting across from a legal officer who explained that her contract would be terminated as written but that a new one was on the table, one that came with more clearance, more walls, and less ability to talk about anything she did. The reprimand would follow her on certain forms, closing doors to straightforward civilian work, but the classified commendation attached to the same file would open others, turning her into something the institution had not planned for but now could not ignore. The SEAL she had saved found quiet ways to send messages through unofficial channels. A brief nod in a hallway when paths crossed on base, a short handwritten note with no details that said only "we remember," a coffee left at her elbow in a secure lounge without a word. Because they could not post about her or tell stories at bars without touching classified ground. Their gratitude lived in small signals instead of speeches, and those signals built a different kind of legend, one that moved only inside circles that understood what a valley full of hidden rifles felt like. Doctrine changed gradually, not with fanfare but with new lines in training manuals and scenario scripts that described emergency override conditions for non-standard assets under imminent mass casualty threat. Her calm scanning and angle counting, once marked as weird, appeared as bullet points in a training module credited vaguely to field data from recent contact, and recruits who had never heard her name practiced drills based on a pattern she had carved into stone with a borrowed gun. She signed the new contract not because she trusted the institution completely, but because she could not forget the sound of engines rolling toward a valley or the look in a medic's eyes when bandages ran thin. And the offer to be positioned where her numbers might matter earlier was the closest thing to an honest response she had been given. The price was clear. More missions that would never be publicly acknowledged, more action she could never describe to family, and a future where the cleanest parts of her story lived in secure servers and redacted transcripts. Years later, operators who had once dismissed the nerd with the tablet would see her step onto a range or into a briefing room and fall quiet, not because of rank on her chest, which remained minimal, but because they had heard enough whispers to know that somewhere in a valley full of invisible rifles, she had turned equations into exits. The official record would always describe that day as a complex engagement resolved with minimal casualties, carefully avoiding how close it had come to catastrophe and who had actually broken the pattern. She carried that gap between truth and paper like another piece of gear, heavy but familiar, because the residue cost of being believed only in classified spaces was that the world outside saw nothing at all. Still, when new teams walked out with updated rules and emergency clauses that would prevent the next valley from becoming an uncorrected mistake, she understood that the system had changed just enough to make the risk she took matter beyond one convoy. In the end, her name rarely appeared in after-action summaries, but the shape of her decisions lived in them, in the clauses that allowed a trapped unit to act based on numbers instead of waiting for someone far away to admit they might be wrong. She became, in the quiet corners where operators traded stories without dates or coordinates, the answer to a specific question: what happens when the person the system underestimates is the only one who understands how all the angles add up? And because of that, even if most people never heard the story of the day the SEALs warned of hidden snipers and one woman took them all out, the people who needed that story, those who might someday lie under stone while unseen barrels searched for them, carried it forward as a warning and a map, proof that sometimes the difference between a trap and an exit is whether the right person is allowed to pull the trigger.